What is the likelihood that a 40-year-old or 50-year-old person today could actually live forever?
So I think that the chance for a 40-year-old is more than 50%.
Have you ever considered that you may not have to die of aging? This is what this video is about. It's a very special interview with Aubrey de Grey, who is one of the leading scientists within longevity. And he claims that if you are younger than 60 years old today, you actually have a pretty good shot at not dying from aging. This is a debate you don't hear a lot about from mass media. Nonetheless, it is super important for all of us because if it's actually possible to live much longer, healthy lives, talking 500 years plus, everything would start to change. The way we plan our lives, the way we live our lives. Listen to this interview and make up your own mind. Do you think it's possible in this decade or the next to defeat aging? Welcome, Aubrey. It's a great pleasure to have you here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
For me, you're a little bit like the grandfather of longevity, escape velocity. Would that kind of be correct to define you that way?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I invented the term. I think the concept was somewhat discussed prior to that. Around the same time that I started using that term, which is about 20 years ago, Ray Kurzweil started using the phrase live long enough to live forever, which encapsulates more or less the same thing.
So I think what everybody is really curious about when they start to think about LEV is, for example, my average viewer, I think they would be about 40 years old. So what would you say, what is the likelihood of a 40-year-old person today who's in pretty good health, that person could live forever or at least not die from aging?
Right. So not dying from aging is, of course, the point, because I'm not working on stopping people from being hit by trucks or stopping the planet from being hit by an asteroid. Though, of course, I'm very pleased that other people are working on those things. So I think that the chance for a 40-year-old today in the Western world is more than 50%. I have said that I've been giving time frame estimates for how long it's going to take to get to LEV for some time. And my current estimate is 12 to 15 years, in other words, late 2030s. And the people who will benefit from this kind of technology when it comes along will be people who are typically in their 60s at that time. So that means someone who's 40 now has a good chance.
For the viewers who are slightly older, including myself, I'm 50. Well, what would you say to them? Is there still hope, or is it tight?
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, let's be clear that the major uncertainty here is how soon we will actually reach LEV. That's a point in time that one of my colleagues has called the Methuselarity, by contrast with the singularity. The idea is that I think it's 50% likely that we'll get there in the next 12 to 15 years, but there's at least a 5% chance that we won't get there for 100 years if we just hit a whole bunch of unforeseen obstacles. However, what we can certainly say is that one's chances of benefiting are not really determined by one's chronological age at all. They're determined by one's biological age. Essentially, even the kind of first generation rejuvenation therapies, which will probably be in various ways quite clunky. They will work for people who have got maybe 10 or 20 years life left in them, but they'll probably be too strenuous and for people who are already at death's door. So if you're an average 50-year-old, you've got a pretty good chance. If you're a better than average 61-year-old like me, you've got a pretty good chance. But it's only a chance. We can never know with any pioneering technology.
So, as you explained, it's all about biological age. But what would kind of be the top three pieces of advice you would be giving to people who would like to, well, be there for LEV and to keep their biological age low?
Well, the three types of advice of the kind that you're looking for are very boring. They are essentially, they come down to live the way your mother told you to. Don't get seriously overweight, don't smoke, get enough sleep, have a reasonably varied diet. But of course, the real answer is that because the issue is how soon it's going to happen, one of the biggest things you can do is to try to make it happen sooner. Obviously, some people are wealthy enough to be able to make a difference by supporting the research financially. And I spend a painful amount of my time raising money to do raising small amounts of money to do the most important work. Some people will do what you're doing right now. They will get the word out to the wider world by interviewing me or whatever. Who are going into biology, for example, as youngsters, can pick what field they go into on the basis of its impact on all of this. You know, pretty much anyone can do advocacy of one sort or another. They can, talk to their friends, their family, their colleagues. When it comes to financial contributions, I always say, first of all, every dollar counts. We're going to always have more small donors than large donors. But also, I want to emphasize that that the poorer you are, the more people you know who are wealthier than you. So that again brings it back to advocacy. And honestly, if one does the arithmetic, one can make more of a difference that way than one can by living the way your mother told you to. Quite apart from the fact that one will make more of a difference to everybody else, not just oneself.
I'm actually coming back to kind of the financial part of the whole thing, and what we can do there. I mean, I follow some of the people that you're probably aware about as well, like Brian Johnson and Kurzweil that you just mentioned yourself. So, and they take a whole bunch of supplements like NAD boosters, NMM, and so on. Do you think they make a difference at this point?
It's completely unclear. There have been some studies that show that people who take a lot of supplements on average live slightly less long than people who don't, but I wouldn't read too much into that either. I think the key message is that everyone's metabolism is different. Everyone has slightly different needs, different strengths and weaknesses in how their body works, and that means that different things are going to benefit different people. The only thing that I will say is that the magnitude of the benefit is likely to be really rather small compared to the magnitude that I'm hoping to bring about by technology that's on the horizon. Um, you know, Maybe you might get a year or two out of extra life if you do these kinds of things, if you're lucky. Now, of course, the fact that different people are different means that the more you can do to understand your own metabolism, to understand what your strengths and weaknesses are, the more likely you are to be able to benefit yourself by such means. And Brian Johnson is setting a really important example in that regard by measuring absolutely everything he can and doing and constantly tweaking his regime accordingly. One doesn't have to be spending $2 million a year on oneself the way Brian does in order to do that. But yeah, I mean, it's important to keep in mind the magnitude of the best case scenario.
Could you kind of paint a picture for us on kind of the way to LEV? Like, is it like first we'll get one technology saying, the treatment for the zombie cells, then we'll get like the lengthening of the telomeres, and then it's gene therapy. I mean, is it something like that, or is it more kind of one wonder pill we're looking for?
Definitely not one wonder pill. It's very much a divide and conquer approach, as you describe. But the other thing to be very clear about is that the impact of this panel of interventions will not rise linearly with the number of interventions. Until we get to a certain level of comprehensiveness, we will see essentially nothing because we will not be addressing all of the life-threatening processes in the body, the accumulations of various types of damage. We need to address them all. Now, what we do not need to do is address them all perfectly. And that's where we can come on to the definition of longevity, escape velocity, and so on, which I guess you want me to do. But we do need to be reasonably comprehensive. And and once we are, then we gain maybe 20 years of additional life, which is very, very much more than what anyone can do with anything that's available today.
I mean, I was speculating, could you in one way argue that we may already have longevity escape velocity? Let me just give you an example. So let's say I'm 51 now and my biological age is the same. So now I do everything to turn my life around. And as far as I can kind of research myself to, perhaps I could reduce my biological age by 5 years or so. And then perhaps in 5 years already, you would have something that could reduce it a little bit more. And so practically that for some people who become very diligent that we could be there already. Does that make any sense?
Not really. And the reason it doesn't is because the measures of biological age that we have today are very inaccurate, incomplete. Um, and I'm talking here about all the kinds of measures. I'm talking about the ones that people talk about a lot these days, the omic ones, especially the epigenetic ones. And I'm also talking about the more traditional things, based on function, things like measuring grip strength and gait speed and memory and so on. Um, you know, you may be if you try to condense all of that down to one number, then it's going to be inherently incomplete in terms of what it tells you. What we really want to emphasize is that one is as biologically old as one's weakest link. Um, in other words, even if there's anything wrong, you might not even have detected it, but it will be enough to ensure that you don't live significantly longer than you would have lived anyway. Um, but that's not to say don't do this, because you've got a chance of hitting everything, and the more you hit, the better.
Okay, so what you're saying is it could be that the weakest link would be like the lungs or the kidney, and so no matter how much you reduce aging in other areas of the body, that part might be the one that kills you at exactly the same time.
Or almost exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Still believe that it's kind of fairly accurate that if you do everything diligently today, that you can reduce kind of your average biological age of the body by around 5 years, or is it kind
I
of
think
making?
I think that's probably not far off. And yeah, if we accept that we can talk about something called average biological age, then yeah, I think that's probably reasonable. But what that means for how long you can extend your health span, that remains to be seen.
It might be a silly question, but with your experience, can you look at a person and kind of gauge whether they are above or below their biological age? I mean, would there be
Yeah,
some sign?
definitely not. I mean, of course, there are some indicators. People's appearance does tell you something about their age, and yes, it's definitely their biological age that it's telling you about, but
Yeah.
very, very inaccurately. I would certainly never try to guess somebody's age.
So I think you alluded to it a little bit before, but you still need to be like in some decent health or shape to take advantage of LEV once it's here. I understood. Can you describe a little bit more about like the least, the basic condition you need to be in to take advantage?
Well, it's not really, because I mean, a lot of the detail of what the actual delivery of these treatments is going to look like is completely speculative at this point. I mean, if anything that's more than a decade away, we just don't know. Um, I would expect that even from the beginning, most of these treatments will be delivered by injection into the bloodstream, and that, from the point of view of the recipient of these treatments, will actually look like one magic bullet, because you can inject a lot of things at the same time in the same injection, in the same way that today we have like the MMR vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella. That's not one vaccine at all. It's three vaccines that you happen to receive all at the same time. So you could easily imagine an injection of 300 things that involve stem cells and gene therapy viruses and so on. However, at the beginning, when this all starts coming along, as I say, it won't be complete. It won't be completely comprehensive, and in particular, it may be quite difficult to do a number of these things, such that, for example, rejuvenating the liver may end up being easier to do by simply growing a new liver in the lab and then transplanting it the way you would for a regular liver transplant today. No, that is surgery, and there's a reason why people who are very frail and not likely to live very long do not often receive surgery. Namely, it's more likely to do them more harm than good.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I wanted to talk a little bit about how people receive you and how people receive the idea of LEV. I first learned about it about 10 years ago, and I remember I talked to my boss at Meta about it, and I mean, this is the tech environment, and he was still like, "What are you talking about? You sound like a crazy man now." I think today it's like a little better, but still like This is the response I get from the, I would say, average person. What is your experience?
Mhm.
Are people starting to accept the idea of LEV, or not?
Certainly, the level of acceptance is growing quite rapidly now. However, I'll tell you that when I started out 20 or so years ago, trying to explain everything I was thinking and doing to the wider world, and indeed to the academic community, I was pretty shocked at how much resistance there was to the concept of LEV. Because to me, the LEV concept is actually far less controversial than the the nuts and bolts of how we're going to get there, the comprehensive rejuvenation. I started talking nearly a quarter of a century ago about things we're going to need to do to actually eliminate the various types of damage that the body does to itself throughout life. And some of those technologies are definitely quite ambitious. And therefore the time frame for actually they're coming to fruition is very uncertain indeed. And so I was expecting pushback on that, and certainly I had plenty. I was able to persuade people over the years that the things I was suggesting were not as crazy as they might have seemed at first hearing. And so I basically won that argument. And now that concept of rejuvenation, which I started to kind of use as the word to describe all of this 20 years ago, that concept is now very widely understood, and you have whole conferences and journals and so on that use that word. Um, so that's great. But still, yes, the resistance to the whole concept of LEV is paradoxically much stronger. And I believe that the main reason is that people jump to the conclusion that people are going to live indefinitely. People who are alive today have a good chance of living indefinitely, and they say, well, that's obviously wrong. And then they therefore, because they just do trend analysis, they just say, okay, how fast has life expectancy been rising in the past? And as far as I'm concerned, that's a good enough argument to simply not even bother looking at how I reach my conclusion and just reject it out of hand. Now, the people who do not reject it out of hand, and indeed who are exactly at the opposite end of the spectrum and say, well, yeah, obviously that's true, um, tend to be the tech people with a background in maths. It's only elementary maths that one needs to realize that if the way in which we're going to get even 20 years of extra life is by comprehensive rejuvenation, then the achievement of longevity escape velocity is absolutely inevitable. It's inescapable.
So, do you think some of the resistance is about something else? I mean, not when we're talking about scientists, but normal people. When I talk about it, I get a lot of kind of middle-aged. I don't know if we should say older people, who would say, "But that's an awful thought. Who would want to live forever?" And I would say, "Well, in good health, well, me for one." Um,
Mhm.
but the gut reaction of a lot of people is that's not a good thing, which I cannot explain, but it seems to be a popular opinion.
Well, right. So of course, I have encountered that view. Doubts about the desirability of bringing aging under comprehensive control, just as much as I have encountered doubts about the feasibility. And the funny thing is that they go together. They kind of feed on each other in most people's minds. You'll have it. Essentially, what's going on is people will say, or they'll be thinking, well, I choose not to actually take seriously and even debate the idea that we might be able to defeat aging properly because it would be a bad thing. And so we wouldn't, who cares, right? But the same people at the same time will also say, well, I choose not to debate really whether, this is actually a good thing or not because it's obviously impossible. So they decide each of these things and they kind of reinforce each other. And so a large part of what I have to do is to kind of embarrass people into admitting that these are two separate questions and addressing them separately. And then one can make a little progress. But yeah, I mean, of course, it's no surprise at all that people are spectacularly irrational about the prospect of doing something about aging, because at the end of the day, they just don't want to get their hopes up. Everyone knows that we've been um, aware since the beginning of civilization that there's this absolutely appalling thing that's going to happen to all of us once if we live long enough and don't get eaten by tigers or whatever. and there's nothing we can do about it. And I also know that people have been saying that there is something we can do about it in various ways since more or less the dawn of civilization, and they've always been wrong. So, the idea that we might be right this time is something that one is legitimately hesitant to accept. And as such, one, doesn't really, I mean, unless one is the kind of geek, I guess, or person who thinks like a geek, who is willing to, is comfortable with probabilities, shall we say, is comfortable with uncertainty, then one's just going to, come up with rationalizations. And it doesn't matter how irrational those rationalizations are, just as long as they work to put the thing out of your mind and get on with your miserably short life and make the best of it rather than being preoccupied by this terrible thing.
Yeah, one thing I thought about is that at the point that people start believing that LAV could happen, they might take some different decisions, because like the dividends you get of staying healthy and being a little bit cautious are huge, right? I mean, for people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, 10 more good years could be the difference between, I guess, living not indefinitely, but until you are hit by a truck, and dying in perhaps your 70s. Do you think people kind of realize that the stakes are getting higher, and that there's more benefit to be healthy?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, really, you can think of it as basically it's people feeling that they've got permission to get emotionally invested in this. Um, so yeah, I mean, actually, I believe that that's going to happen a lot sooner. So I talk about a time frame of 12 to 15 years before we achieve the sufficient comprehensiveness to get to longevity escape velocity. But the bigger question is, how soon will most people switch from their current thinking into a thinking that, yeah, this is coming. We don't know how soon it's coming exactly, but we know it's coming fairly soon. I thought about that a lot because the big question is, how will that change happen? What will be the change in, let's call it the public conversation about all of this, that that will shift the public opinion and cause this sea change? Um, and then how soon will that happen? And the conclusion that I came to a long time ago, and I very much believe it still, is that it's all about the more high-profile scientists in this area. So I've obviously been saying since forever that this is coming, albeit I don't know how soon. But none of my colleagues have been doing so until quite recently. A large part of that is because I had the good fortune to be able to get myself into a position where basically I wasn't reliant on being popular. I didn't have to worry about my next grant application being rejected in peer review um, because I was getting my funding from philanthropy. Similarly, I wasn't in a situation in industry where I might like the share price of my company might be affected if I started saying controversial things. So I was able to say all this, and my colleagues were not. But now that things have moved forward enough that people are saying somewhat more optimistic things, and there will come a point when most of my colleagues are saying somewhat more, considerably more optimistic things. Actually, there will come a point where people are willing to put timeframes on this. Those timeframes will be probabilistic, just as mine have always been, but nevertheless, that to me is going to be the tipping point, because that's the point at which people like Oprah Winfrey are going to start paying attention and saying publicly that this is going to happen, and perhaps that we ought to work a bit to try and get it to happen soon. Um, and the minute that happens, well, you know what happens when Oprah Winfrey says anything, right? So there's going to be an absolute avalanche. Now the question then is, when is that going to happen? And of course, there are not very many high-profile scientists in this area, and we're all good friends. We all know each other's positions very well, and each other's sensitivities and so on. So I feel I have a pretty damn good read on how much more progress is going to need to be made in various laboratories around the world, including my own, um, to so that those experts will feel that they have, if you like, permission to say more gung ho things. And I believe it's only going to be a few years. I think we've got a 50-50 chance of getting there within 3 or 4 years. So then let's think about what the response of the general public is going to be, because this is where it gets terrifying. If you think about it, pretty much all of the big ticket items that drive the global economy, the things that people spend large proportions of their income on, revolve around how long they expect to live and how long they expect to live healthily, right? That determines what kind of pension plan they want, what kind of life insurance, what kind of health insurance, what kind of inheritance arrangements, you name it. So, they're going to suddenly they're going to literally almost overnight go from a situation of expecting to live only a few years longer than their parents did to a situation of expecting, with reasonable probability, to live vastly longer, even though the technologies that will enable them to do so have not yet actually arrived. They're going to demand different things, and nobody's going to be ready. So when I give talks to, pension funds or insurance companies or whatever, the title of my talk is usually Anticipate the Anticipation. In other words, that these companies, and of course not just companies, but also governments and so on, need to be getting ahead of the problem. They need to be figuring out what products people are going to want when they have a different expectation and how to deliver those products. And I normally put it in mercenary terms. I say, listen, if you don't do this anticipation of the anticipation, then you're going to go bankrupt awfully soon because your competitors will have done and so on. But the point is, these are people who are particularly susceptible to the logic of trend analysis. They make all their predictions that way, which means that, these people are terribly courteous to me usually, but I get the very firm impression that they'll go away and sleep on it, and the following morning they'll wake up with all a bad dream and they'll just get on and do what they were doing anyway, which is not good. So I'm trying to fix that, but it's an uphill battle.
I think there's kind of a parallel to the whole AGI development, where that will also change all structures once that happens. And still, the politicians that I am in dialogue with, they're like, yeah, but it's not a popular subject, so we're not really touching it. Um, but how much is there a connection between reaching AGI, like Kurzweil, for example, is talking on about in 2029? Because then Kurzweil also says once we reach AGI in 2029, we will also reach LEV. What do you think? Is that connected?
So there is a connection, but we have to be very careful. Um, First of all, there's a similarity between AGI and LEV, which is that um, what really matters is not whether we have computers that can do absolutely everything. What matters is whether we have computers that can do a sufficient proportion of things that we normally do, that society will respond to that. Essentially, the question is, will we continue to have an economy founded on the concept of essentially full employment? And I think it's at this point highly reasonable to suppose that by about 2029, 2030-ish, given the rate of progress that we're seeing today, that AI research will have reached the point where a full employment-based economy is looking pretty damned unsustainable, just because so many fewer people are needed to do things. Now, of course, how that translates into equitable distribution of wealth is extremely messy. At the moment, we've got one idea, the concept of universal basic income. It's a very blunt instrument, and it's hardly being explored. So again, this is something where I believe we are really shooting ourselves in the foot as a society by not anticipating all of this and thinking much more deeply and clearly about how an economy that's not based on work will actually operate. In terms of the direct linkage, let's say the causal linkage between high-powered artificial intelligence and reaching LEV, I think one thing we have to very strongly bear in mind, and I will say we have to bear this in mind today because a number of the most influential people in the field right now are getting this wrong. The reason why AI gets to be good at something is by having experience, having data to work from. Now, in some cases where the things that it's working on are essentially defined mathematically, like playing Go, it turns out that data is not so important, except in the development of the software. But if you're doing anything that is, relating to the way that the physical world works, and especially anything related to the world's most complicated machine, namely the human body, then you need a lot of data. And at the moment, we have a lot of some types of data, omic data, lots of genome sequences and such like. And that's very valuable. But there are masses of types of data that are just as vital for AI to have any chance of helping us to get to longevity escape velocity that basically don't exist at all. And those types of data need to be obtained. So the billionaires and such like who are putting serious money into longevity research right now, they badly need not to conclude that work in laboratories is passe, and all that matters is to fund the artificial intelligence research. And I'm afraid a few of those people are going in that direction right now. Sam Altman is the most conspicuous one. He put a very significant amount of money, $180 million, into one very good startup company named Retro. But since then, he hasn't done anything like that. And I have on good authority that he's not going to, that he wants to only focus on AI. He's got a very successful AI company, so it kind of makes sense to put a lot of focus on that. But putting an exclusive focus on it is very misguided.
So, looking at these rich, influential individuals, I try to do a bit of research, and it seems like Peter Thiel, Jeff Bezos, Jim Mellon, and Larry Page, to name a few, are some of those who invest quite a lot somehow into longevity. But do you see a shift, like you mentioned Oprah Winfrey yourself? So do you think certainly we will see not 10 billionaires, but half of all billionaires saying, well, this is my only ticket to stay alive. This is, I should put all my money here.
Well, we are seeing that. I mean, for sure, there's a great many more wealthy people actually putting their money where they ought to than there used to be. Jeff Bezos, fine example. That Jeff Bezos was introduced to the field by my TED talk, which was more than 15 years ago. And he was interested. He was very interested. He would always, have conversations with me at TED every year, and that was wonderful. But it took him 15 years to actually bite the bullet and start putting money into it. And you know, that's a shame. That's a big shame. So there's other people who have still not done so, despite having all the information. And some people, when they do it, they get it completely wrong. So Larry and Sergey, the Google twins, they were aware of that they were in conversations with me, back in like 2005. And when they finally pulled the trigger in about 2013, they got it completely wrong. And lo and behold, Google Calico has done exactly nothing, and it'll be a complete accident if it ever does do anything of any significance, because they just hired the wrong people at the top. Well, some of the wrong people. So yeah, I mean, it's like, anyone who's doing something pioneering, leading a crusade like me, is always going to have this frustration, that some people just don't listen or don't think about the things the right way. Every billionaire is different, and they're entitled to spend their money how they want. So it's up to me to persuade them otherwise.
So looking at some of the people who are starting to get traction in terms of, you could say, the followers and who are getting public attention. So I'm thinking again like Brian Johnson that we discussed. He has more than 1 million followers now on YouTube. David Sinclair has maybe 300,000, something like that. But that's only YouTube,
of
I
living
guess. If you
indefinitely, but so that
combine
we can
the
each be
platforms,
our
they
very
have
best
several
self.
million.
And as
called aging
So in
science,
that community,
longevity science. Some people
would
call
you
it anti-aging.
characterize you as part of that community, or are they very different in terms of what they're doing and what they're saying?
Oh, I'm very much part of that community. But let's be clear, everyone's got their own emphasis, whether it's in terms of what they do in the lab or whether it's in terms of what they talk about on stage and on camera. And that's how we need, that's the way it ought to be. We want people to be playing to their strengths and doing everything right. So David Sinclair and I have been great friends for 20 years, and we have a lot in common, in healthy disrespect for authority, things like that. But we also are chalk and cheese in other ways. I don't have an entrepreneurial bone in my body, and David is a very proud entrepreneur, and that is reflected in the way we say things, the way we look, the way we what we emphasize, and that's a good thing.
I mean, do you agree with the way that him and Brian Johnson are getting a lot of attention? Do you think that is kind of the way to kind of will get more funding for the right things?
Well, I mean, it's a somewhat fine line that one has to walk. For sure, one's not going to get funding if one doesn't get attention. So that's important. But then, of course, the question is whether the way in which one gets attention has, trade-offs, if you like. So when I started talking about 1,000-year lifespans, a lot of people tried to say that I didn't mean it, that I was just saying it in order to get on the front of magazines. Now, I'm actually not like that. I've never once said anything that I didn't firmly believe, but I could have chosen to go the other way. I could have deliberately avoided saying that in order to maintain, respectability among the mainstream academic community. But I saw very rapidly that that was nonsense, that, people who prioritize respectability get basically nothing done. And so I went out and told it like it is, and it seems to have been reasonably effective. I'm very proud at the extent to which I've been able to contribute to the growth of this community, not just to the science itself. You know, David has received a lot of criticism recently for, in many experts' eyes, overstating the efficacy of his own work and of work that's closely related to his own work. And to some extent, I have sympathy with that criticism. But the fact is, it's not exactly unusual for people who are selling things or who are developing things with a view to selling them soon, to walk that fine line. And so, I'm somewhat charitable when it comes to that.
And when you look at the way Brian Johnson, for example, approaches things like measuring everything in his body and kind of then sharing that data, is that helpful to the research?
It is. So Brian Johnson is, very much leading by example. He's obviously an outlier in terms of what he's able to do because he's very wealthy. When he goes out on stage and on camera, he's spectacularly open and, direct and honest about everything he does and why he does these things. And people therefore immediately see the differences and the similarities between him and themselves, whatever those differences may be, depending on the person, right? And that's the way to go. I mean, that's a huge part of why I've been successful, is that people just trust me. They know that whether they agree with me or not, that I'm sincere. I know my shit. That's what it's all about. And so I feel Brian is doing very much the same thing in his own way.
If you look at kind of the predictions for LAV, it seems that you're not anymore kind of the most optimistic, because there are people like Kurzweil who say 2029. I think Elon Musk, I don't know if he has said it directly, but everything with Elon seems to be next year. Um, have you stayed consistent with around late 2030s?
I'm not sure that Elon has said anything about this. Elon actually has been a bit of an outlier among vocal, wealthy geeks, because he has tended to say that he's not really sure that it's a good idea to do anything about aging, which is a bit of a shame. Though I think he has been kind of embarrassed into having another look at that question, and maybe he's shifting his position. Kurzweil has always been more optimistic than me, at least a little bit more. And, that's partly because he has placed a greater emphasis than I have on the contribution from AI. But, the differences are not enormous in terms of how many years. The really big thing that's happened is that a few, hardcore biologists have started to come out and give actual timeframe predictions, albeit, carefully, probabilistically, like me. So George Church has done this. David Sinclair, of course, has done it. I think this is critical. If you go back into the early history of my dealings with the academic community, back in 2003, I wrote a paper called "The Duty of Biogerontologists to Discuss Timeframes Publicly," in which I made the point that if you don't do this, people are just going to carry on believing that it's all a pipe dream, and they won't support increases in funding. It'll be just shooting ourselves in the foot. And of course, scientists will be terribly, moralistic about it, and they'll say, "Oh well, it's science, isn't it? We don't know how long it's going to be. Therefore, we shouldn't, get people's hopes up. We shouldn't overpromise and underdeliver." And I always say, yes, dear, but you're underpromising here because everyone else's view in the wider world is that this is completely science fiction, and there's exactly zero probability that we'll ever achieve all of this. So unless you can robustly defend that view, then you are putting your own bias into the system. And that argument has never held sway among my colleagues at all. It's been extremely frustrating to me. But yeah, I mean, my timeframes have shifted, but not by much. And in particular, they've hardly shifted at all in the past 10 years. I started predicting dates for the 50% chance of achieving longevity escape velocity about 20 years ago, 2004-ish. And back then I said I thought that it would take about 25 years, which means around 2030, right? Around the same date that Kurzweil now says. But everything I said back then, I always made clear that not only was it a probabilistic prediction, but it was also subject to funding. And at that point, I was pretty hopeful that we would start bringing reasonable money in, such that money would not be rate limiting. And sure enough, things did start to go well not long after that. Peter Thiel gave me a respectable amount starting in 2006. It wasn't nearly as much as it needed to be. And my estimate was that things were going perhaps 3 times more slowly than they could have done if money were not rate limiting. And sure enough, my time frame slipped, from 2030 down to the late 2030s. But over the past 10 years, since basically I've won the rejuvenation battle, and most of my colleagues are talking about rejuvenation reasonably, sure enough, the money has started to flow, and my timeframes have hardly slipped at all in the past 10 years. Now, I will say, I want to very strongly emphasize this, that even though there is very, very much more money in the field now than there was even 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, that money is extremely unevenly distributed. There are areas, and of course, these are the areas that I focus on because I always try to do the hardest stuff that nobody else is doing. There are areas which are still really struggling to get even the little bit of money in the door that's necessary to get them done. And, it's quite difficult. It's quite frustrating that's the case because, when people like myself are out there explaining what needs to be done, as clearly as I possibly can, and people just would prefer to make money tomorrow or whatever. And that's a large part of it. The people who used to be big donors and have ceased to be, Peter Thiel being one, they were never donors by choice. They were just smart enough to know that they could only ever become investors if they donated enough to be able to get some of the technologies to progress to the point of being investable. But unfortunately for the other areas that are still not investable, that has happened. And so the people who prefer to invest rather than donate are writing bigger checks than they used to, but they're writing them in a narrower scope.
So what could be done about this? Is it more and better information to the people with deep enough pockets to fund this?
Information certainly matters. And, one of the advantages of the structure that the path that I've chosen to lead in terms of organization, namely that I lead a nonprofit, or I've led a succession of nonprofits, one of the advantages is that I don't have to worry about things like protecting intellectual property with trade secrets, or publication priority, for making sure that I get lots of credit so that I get my next grant application funded. I don't have to worry about that kind of thing. So that means that I'm able to go out and talk about interim results whenever I like. There's this really nice big experiment that we've been doing for the past 18 months, trying to combine a variety of rejuvenation interventions in the same mice at the same time. And I've been putting updates out on Twitter and Facebook every month. And that has definitely worked. It's definitely excited people. now that experiment is nearing its conclusion, and I'm in a position to be able to actually go and talk about the results. I was in Copenhagen just this past week. Just in fact, the day before yesterday, I gave a talk to a very large number of the top people in the field, which I'm very pleased to say was very well received. And so, you know, I've definitely got all the relevant approval, but unfortunately, the people in that audience are not billionaires. I still haven't got the money to do the next experiment, which we've had planned for the past 9 months. I mean, again, you know, it's not just the billionaires. If I were able to get 100,000 people, each of them giving me $50, that would be quite good enough. But yeah, here we are, so to speak.
Okay, so if people wanted to support, how would they actually go about doing that?
Oh, well, I mean, we have a website with a donate button, you know, same as any other nonprofit does. So yes, absolutely. I mean, there are all the usual ways to support this work financially. If you want to transfer a very substantial amount, obviously just get in touch and we'll figure out the best way to do it that suits your circumstances. Um,
Okay, that's great. I'll definitely put the link in the description. Um, what about the politicians and governments in general? Do you think they will help, or do you think they will regulate to actually delay LEV?
Politicians are really easy to understand. You know, donors are really hard to understand. Everyone is different. But And I've always said scientists are really easy to understand. All they care about is whether they get the next grant application funded. Politicians are also really easy to understand. They have one goal in life, which is to get re-elected. So I have historically spent very little of my time trying to even talk to politicians. It's a waste of time. You know, they'll be very nice, they'll be very polite, but at the end of the day, unless they have been convinced that the thing I'm asking them to do has electoral advantages, that there are votes in it, they won't do it. So I've been wasting my breath. Now, of course, as time goes on, there will be more and more votes in it, and so that's the way to change public policy, is to change public opinion first, really. But in kind of anticipation of that, I have certainly been engaging more with people in the corridors of power. I generally try not to do it myself because, you know, I just look too much of a heretic, and, you know, I have a reputation for that. I prefer to work through colleagues who have, you know, perhaps fewer rough edges. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot more engagement of the political top brass in many countries, especially in the US, than there used to be.
Maybe to round off the interview, are there some kind of rumors you would like to debunk about longevity, escape velocity, and aging in general? Something you think that most people don't know or misunderstand?
Sure. I think probably the single biggest misunderstanding on the part of society, and I will be clear, this is largely the fault of my colleagues in the academic community, is that there is some mysterious thing called aging itself, which is in some meaningful qualitative way distinct from the diseases of old age. That is absolute arrant nonsense. There is absolutely no such difference. The only difference between things that we call aging and things that we call age-related diseases is that the so-called age-related diseases are simply the aspects of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to. And more precisely, that means that they are the aspects of the later stages of aging. Aging, in fact, is perfectly well understood. Of course, not in detail, but it doesn't need to be understood in all its details. It is simply the combination of two processes. Yes, there's this late stage of aging, which is the appearance and progression of various chronic conditions, which I don't think should even be called diseases, because they are ultimately side effects of being alive. Um, and they come along late in life as a result of the other process, which is going on throughout life, which is the progressive and initially inert accumulation of various types of molecular and cellular damage. The reason why they are initially inert and only cause the health problems of late in life, is because the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of those changes. It better be, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to reproduce before those things happen. But yeah, that's all aging is. Aging is not a mystery. And if we can get away from the idea that aging is such a separate thing, then that would be enormous progress. But it's very entrenched. It's entrenched in funding structures. The National Institute of Health is built as something that, where each age-related disease is a separate silo, and then there's this separate thing called the National Institute on Aging, which, makes it sound as though it's a separate thing. And similarly, the way that my colleagues mostly talk about aging, they like to use the word aging. They like to talk about this thing called the aging process. And really, it's just politics. They'll do that because they get funded by organizations that have the word aging in their names. But that's not a good enough reason.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point to kind of refocus the concept of aging to a disease that we can actually cure. So thank you so much for meeting me here online.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.